So the neglect of the dying resulted from scientific advances in medicine. The dying became failures and were ignored. And this is something which we are all aware of. Over the years, as science has progressed, the longevity has increased. We are living for longer periods of time, although the quality of life hasn't improved very much. Although we are living for longer, but then we are dying very lonely, painful, and very expensive deaths. So that is a sad fact of modernization of medicine. So this is actually how most of us would die, which is a very sad fact. And most of us who have money, like health insurance, or if you are wealthy enough, uh, you would be doomed to die in this manner, alone, hooked onto life sustaining equipment. And you can actually notice the hands are also tied down to the bedside, and so that even if you want to call out to somebody for help, because you can't speak, you're intubated, and even if you want to call out to somebody, you can't do so. Your hands are also tied down, and this is really a sad way of dying. But then this is one of the fallouts of modern medicine, you can say. So this is a state which should be avoided at all costs. So since our medical training, since we have been in medical school, we have been systematically and thoroughly programmed. I prefer to use the word programming, because we are taught, we are sort of focused, we are mentally taught to focus on certain aspects, like that we can cure anyone, that death is a failure, failure is not an option. When in doubt, just do more tests. When really in doubt, order another consultation, right? So these sort of things are actually in the back of our minds, because somewhere we have never been taught to actually look upon death or dying as physiology, because death is something which is natural, and that is something which we were never taught. We were always taught to look upon death and dying as a pathology. We were never taught to give death a chance. And that is why we have created a system where the whole process of death and dying has become very lonely, very painful, and very undignified. This picture depicts what it is for the patients who have undergone so many procedures, so many life-prolonging procedures, and who are ultimately doomed to die at home. Most of the times, what the doctors tell the patients when it comes to the last stages, or when all the treatment options have failed, that you just take the patient back home, ghar leke jao, ghar mein seva karo, just take care of your patient at home and whatever it is. But it's not that easy. It's a very difficult and uphill task. There is a saying that patients don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So your degrees, your qualifications doesn't mean much to the patient. What the patient looks for in a doctor is how much time and how much compassion the doctor can give to the patient. That is something which is at a premium for us, because we hardly spend time with our patients. We hardly demonstrate compassion when it comes to, treating our patients. And treating, as I said, we are all treaters. We are not healers. We are just treaters. We have been taught to treat, because for us, death has always been a pathology. Death was never a physiology for us. So what is the doctor's concept of palliative care? So when I'll talk about palliative care in a while, but whenever we are faced with the concept of palliative care, what immediately comes to our mind as a doctor? Euthanasia, or physician-assisted suicide, or giving up or discontinuation of care, morphine drips, last 24 or 48 hours of life, or death squads, literally. So palliative physicians are often looked up in the medical community, even today, sadly, even today, as the last resort. That I have done everything, now there is nothing more to do. Okay, just give a palliative consult and make the patient happy, so that he will stop bothering me. So just refer him to the palliative care physician. But no, that is not the way you need to go about it. That's a wrong way of looking at it. And here is an example of how this gentleman, he was a rickshaw puller. So he needed both his hands to work, and he had a sarcoma in his forearm. And so he went to this great surgeon, and who looked up at his arm, and he did an amputation, as you can see out here. This man had primarily gone to the surgeon with severe pain resulting from the growth in his forearm. So after amputation, the pain still persisted, because if you look closely at his axilla, you can see that already the metastatic disease had spread to the axilla, causing an entrapment neuropathy. So in spite of getting the amputation done, the patient still had that neuropathic pain persisting. So what did he achieve? He achieved nothing. In fact, he was at a greater loss, because now, combined with the loss of his arm, he could no longer pull his rickshaw. So he no longer had any source of income. And if you look if you see the look of despair on his eyes, on his face, which is writ very large, you would understand that somehow we, as medical professionals, have failed him, because we approached him as a treater and not as a healer. This is a sad example of failure of modern medicine. So this is exactly where we need to stop, look back, contemplate, and rethink about what we do in our daily practice and how it can be improved upon. The term palliative care was actually coined by a surgeon, Balfour Mount. And Balfour Mount, if you recall, he at the age when he was hardly 24 years of age, he had testicular cancer. And then when he was in his 60s or 70s, he had CA of the esophagus, for which an extensive surgery was done, and then he was tracheostomized and all that. But then this gentleman, because he suffered so much, he could understand the nature of suffering of others. Because you see, unless you yourself walk the path, you wouldn't understand how difficult it is to walk the path. So Balfour Mount actually had walked the path, and he understood the suffering of the patients and their families, and he made it his mission to help such patients and their families also get over that suffering. And so he had introduced the term palliative care. So what exactly is this palliative medicine? It's a specialized medical care for people with serious illness at any age and at any stage. It's basically a philosophy of care. You just can't call it medicine in its true sense, because medicine is a holistic concept. Palliative care addresses the philosophy of medicine. So palliative care actually is the healer out here. Whereas if you just look at medicine purely, medicine is just the treater. So palliative medicine comes as the healer. So palliative medicine is focused on providing patients with relief from symptoms, be it pain, not only physical symptoms, but also psychological, spiritual, and social. So we are treating the person as a complete human being, with his own wishes, with his own thoughts, with his joys and sorrows and everything. We are treating the person as a person should be treated like. Right? The overall goal of palliative medicine is to improve the quality of life, not only for the patient, but for the whole family. Because in such chronic illnesses and in terminal illnesses, it is not only the patient who is suffering, it is the whole family which is actually suffering. So the 3 C's of palliative care are focused on comfort, good communication, and provision of a continuity of care. See, continuity is very important. It's not that just I go one day and address the needs of the patient. It has to be a continual process because the patient would continue to deteriorate. It's the melting ice situation. You know, if you keep a block of ice on a table, gradually the ice starts getting smaller and smaller, and suddenly there is no ice, there is just water. So you need to wait till the ice is converted to water, and you need to keep watching the ice till it is converted to water. And that is what I call the continuity of care in palliative care. You have to be with the patient and their relatives, you know, till the patient is alive, and even beyond that, during the bereavement period, so that the family gets that support in the bereavement period. So why all this palliative care? You see, death is inevitable. You know, that is the only guarantee which you have in your life, isn't it? After your birth, the only guarantee you have is your death. There is nothing else comes with a guarantee. The sad part is that we have no savings set aside for this guarantee. We save for all things like our son's marriage, our daughter's marriage, we want to buy a house and this and that. But we do not have any savings or any planning or any financial planning for our death. Although death comes with a guarantee. So death is inevitable, but suffering is not inevitable. It is not necessary that you should suffer and die. So why don't you invest in your death so as to ensure that you will not die with suffering? And it is so possible. People are more afraid of pain and suffering than death itself. You ask yourself, how would you like to die? And where would you like to die? And you will have the answers to this question. So where and how? Where would you like to die? How would you like to die? And the third question is, what have you done to ensure the first two questions? What have you actually done till date to ensure that you die wherever you want to die and die in peace or whichever way you want to die? Have you taken any steps? Have you even ever thought of it? Because by the time you think of it, it's already too late. So should we allow suffering? And can we improve the quality of life in the dying? Definitely. We definitely can improve the quality of life in the dying. The traditional paradigm was that do everything until there is nothing more to be done. As it happens, most of the doctors, you know, they keep on treating, and when they see that there's a failure of treatment, they can't save lives, then you refer to palliative care. This is the traditional paradigm. Versus the new paradigm which palliative care offers, that palliative care should be initiated at the time of diagnosis, independent of the prognosis, and delivered in concert with curative or life-extending efforts. So as you see in this graph, the blue part is disease-directed therapy. So early part of the disease process, you're more focused on treatment options. Whereas palliation is also introduced at that point of time, although it is on the smaller aspect. But as the disease progresses, the palliative care aspect grows in size and continues even after death. You see, that is very important. The families need to be reassured. You know, when you lose somebody, who is very close to you, it makes a big difference if the doctor or a nurse or somebody of the healthcare team comes to you and says that, look, whatever you have done, whatever you did for your patient was the very best. Right? So that means a lot, because there is often a sense of guilt, there is often a sense of self-loathing, there is often a sense of transference of that whole pain of dying, you know. So if you actually go and tell the relatives that, look, whatever you did was the very best, it couldn't have been better, it means a lot for the patient's family. So palliative care is simultaneous care. It is not distinct from other treatment modalities. It should go hand in hand, and gradually, as the patient nears his end of life, it becomes more and more progressive. So there was a beautiful study in the New England Journal of Medicine. You see these Kaplan-Meier curves. This showed that if you initiate early palliative care in non-small cell lung cancer, they studied patients with non-small cell lung cancer. They actually showed that early palliative care had a better survival among patients. So those of you who are scientifically very inclined, for them, this is news. So this is your proof that palliative care actually works. And then there is something which the American College of Surgeons had also introduced. That was the TQIP, that is the Trauma Quality Improvement Program. They said that why don't you add palliative care for polytrauma patients? So delivery of palliative care in parallel to trauma care improves quality of life. There was a reduced length of stay, there was reduced cost, and decreased intensity of non-beneficial care in end of life, although there was no change in mortality rate. So if you introduce palliative care in trauma also, simple trauma victims, then also it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. So what exactly is palliative surgery? It's a surgical intervention targeted to make a patient's symptoms less severe, thus making the patient's quality of life better despite negligible impact on patient survival. Here, you're not exactly focusing on the survival. You're focusing on quality of life, that whether my surgery would make the patient's life or whatever little life is left more comfortable for the patient or not. That is the whole ethics of palliative surgery. So what is this palliative surgery? To relieve symptoms, knowing that all tumor cannot be removed, microscopic or gross disease left behind knowingly or unknowingly, and for recurrent or persistent disease, even after primary treatment failure. And there are so many goals of palliative surgery, like evaluation of extent, control of locoregional spread, control of fungating tumor, and so on. Surgical reconstruction with flaps also are included. Now, there is something which we should all be aware of. Once you step into the fort of palliative surgery, you should understand the vulnerability of patients with non-curable cancer, and this calls for moral awareness. There is a lot of background noise, I believe.
Arki, can you mute?
Can you mute others? Yeah, thank you. So when we are focused on palliative surgery, we need to be ethically very, very sensitive, right? So our morality, your own morality and your sense of benevolence and respect for autonomy, all these things become very important at that point of time. I'll just give you the example of this lady. You see this lady, you can see that one leg, she has a below knee amputation on one leg. So she had a osteosarcoma and which had metastasized to her lungs also. And in that condition, there was an amputation. After amputation of her leg with mets in her lungs as well as her brain, she got pregnant. And after her pregnancy, she had a cesarean section and she delivered a female child. Her husband kicked her out of house. She was dumped in her in-laws' place in this condition. And then she had this growth. If you see that growth on her neck, so that was another metastasis to her cervical spine. At this point of time, when she had the metastasis in the cervical spine, she could move her upper limbs. She could not move her lower limbs. That means she was just paraplegic. So some brilliant neurosurgeon at this point of time told the family that you need to get her cervical spine fixed, in spite of the fact that there were already cerebral mets and mets in the spine. So they went for a very expensive procedure fixing the cervical spine, and whatever little savings that this lady had went into the surgical procedure. And after surgery, before surgery, as I said, she was just paraplegic. After surgery, she became quadriplegic. And her extent of suffering, she had something what we call total pain, because physically there was still unrelenting pain, and psychologically she was devastated. So you might say that, okay, what we did was palliative surgery. You can give me justifications about fixing her cervical spine and all that, but then one should also think of the outcomes and what effect would the surgery have on the overall quality of life. You need to strike a balance, and you don't need to explain that balance to everybody out there. You need to justify things to your own self, because you yourself are your own judge and jury. And another example is the very popular cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC, that is hyperthermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy, which they give. It's a huge type of surgery. And I was just going through the reviews, and this a review in the World Journal of Surgical Oncology showed that 25% of the patients studied were readmitted within 6 months. After cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC, 25% readmitted within 6 months, 34% required reintervention. And then there was another systematic review of the quality of life, what these patients have after cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC, which showed there was a reduced quality of life in 3 to 6 months after surgery. And as you are all aware, that this is a very expensive, very, very expensive procedure. So before launching, I'm not saying that this is not effective or what. What I'm trying to say is that whenever you think of any major procedure in a patient, you need to think of so many other things. What effect it would have on the quality of life, and in terms of finances, and so many other things. Because you see, pain in terms of chronic pain is not a very simple concept. Chronic pain is a total sort of concept, is a totalitarian concept, which has physical ramifications, social, emotional, and spiritual ramifications as well. See, the physical part of the pain accounts for hardly 25 to 30% of the total pain. Just 25 to 30%. And all our efforts are just focused on physical pain. You see, if you just review back on your practices, you would give this drug and that drug and so many neuromodulations and so many interventional procedures, all of which are targeted at just the physical pain, and which accounts for hardly 25 to 30% of the total pain. The rest, almost 75% of the pain, that is social, emotional, and spiritual pain, largely goes unaddressed. See, this is again a result of our programming. I would call it misprogramming, because we are not programmed to look into those aspects of the pain. Although that pain, 75% of the pain is accounted for by social, emotional, and spiritual issues. See where we are losing out. And then we keep on complaining that I don't have this drug, I don't have that drug. We have the resources. The resources are all around. As they say, divinity is all around. You don't have to look for God. You can feel God if you really want to feel. It's just like that. You really don't want such states of severe pain and suffering in your patients, because it is in existence, not death, that is the focus of palliative care. We palliative care physicians are not the death squads. We are here to ensure that whatever little life is left, or whatever life is left in you, that few days, whatever days or hours is left, that should be of a good quality, so that you can live life till death. That is the focus of palliative care. Coping with illness, coping with terminal illness can be devastating. Like you see this couple, that lady is down with breast cancer, advanced breast cancer, and that's her husband sitting by her bedside. He knows that within a few months, maybe he will be all alone. Their children are away, they are in they are abroad earning money out there. So this elderly gentleman is just left to fend for himself with his now bedridden wife. And this is the situation which you can see all around. If you just look up, around your neighborhood, you would get so many families of such sort. And it's not necessarily that all of them would be suffering from cancer. The single largest group of people requiring palliative care are the elderly. So in short, all of us are going to require palliative care at some point of time or not, or other. So that is why we need to invest in palliative care, into the concept of palliative care. And this is what I call death insurance. We all invest in what we call life insurance, isn't it? You have so many life insurance policies, but those are all basically useless. That money will only come in once you die. It's your hard-earned money, isn't it? You have worked so hard for it. And at the end, if you can't enjoy that hard-earned money, then what's the use? Rather, if you invest in palliative care, so that your last days of life are sort of guarded, so that you can die a death of dignity, you can die in a place of your choice, that gives more meaning. And that's what I call death insurance. And as Woody Allen had said, it's not that I'm afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And this is a classical example of the death denying culture that we all live in. We are so scared of death that we don't even want to utter the name of death. In Hinduism, there is a book called the Garuda Puran. It is Puran, Garud Puran. And it is usually read when a person dies, when they do the Atvi or Teravi, or, during those Shraddh ceremonies and all. People don't want to keep the Garud Puran in their houses because it is recited only when a patient dies. That is the fear of death which we have. The American College of Surgeons Code of Professional Conduct for Surgeons. Most surgeons are uncomfortable with death. It is an outcome that may be equated with defeat. This is not only true for surgeons, it's true for all branches of medicine. Most surgeons are uncomfortable with the transition from curative to palliative care. We do not want to refer our patients to palliative care till the very last stage, which is wrong. We need to change that culture. Surgeons must accept a pivotal role in facilitating this therapeutic transition. And say, if you have this lady with this fungating growth in her breast, so what would your treatment options be? Would you be thinking of a flap, or would you be thinking of, a surgery, what a debridement type of surgery or whatever? So what would be your first thoughts? Think about it. So whenever you come to face with such a patient, you need to divide your thoughts into 4 aspects. One is the physical aspect of the patient. Second is the psychological aspect of the patient. Third is the social aspect, because you see, such diseases are social diseases, like COVID. You see, COVID, once you know that this guy has COVID, you run for your life, isn't it? So social implications are huge. And then the spiritual, religious and spiritual implications of the disease. That why me? Why is God punishing me? I haven't done wrong. So why is God punishing me? So this why and how questions keep on nagging you, day in, day out. So then we come to medical ethics. So when you're faced with such situations, there are guiding principles which have been laid down. The principles are of non-maleficence, which means that first of all, please don't do any harm. The first principle of medical ethics is please don't do any harm. Second is beneficence, that is do good. But before doing good, please don't do any harm. The third is autonomy. Autonomy means this is my body. I will decide what happens to me, isn't it? Who are you to take decisions for me? I don't want to go to a hospital. I want to die at home. So let me have that choice. But sadly, even people are deprived of this little honor. Once you become unconscious from a stroke, or if you are down with a heart attack or down with a massive stroke or whatever, your relatives will just carry you to a hospital where they will put you in an ICU, and then you're doomed to die hooked on to life-saving, life-sustaining equipment. So autonomy is very important. And that is something which you can do. And those are called advance directives or living wills. And the law regarding living wills has been passed. That's the good part. Although it's so tedious now that it is practically difficult to implement it in a rapid manner. And the fourth principle is that of justice. That is, whatever resources you have, it has to be allocated equally, irrespective of caste, creed, sex, race, and so on. And this is Viktor Frankl. He had written that monumental work called Man's Search for Meaning, and in which he had said that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So remember, even if you stand to lose everything, your money, your freedom, everything, but you still have the right to choose. Even if you're down, suffering, you have the right to choose. You can make that suffering, you can give your suffering a sense of meaning. That choice is yours still. And that is your freedom. You need to understand that. Decision-making capacity. So whenever you're discussing some important surgery with a patient, you need to make the patient understand that what you're trying to tell. To have capacity, one must be able to receive information, perceive and appreciate relevant facts of that information, and willing and able to communicate a choice. So if you see this mentally retarded boy, if you give him a decision, he can't take a decision. For him, his mother, who is a surrogate decision maker, will make a decision on his part. So, but would you like, if you are mentally competent, you being mentally competent, would you like your son to take all decisions on your part, or your daughter to take all decisions on your part? Suppose you are down with a stroke, massive stroke or something. You don't want to go to a hospital. You want to spend your last days at home. But your children insist, no, you have to go to the ICU. Would you like it? And if you don't like it, what steps have you taken to prevent such an occurrence? Have you taken any steps? No. So you see where we fail. And then suddenly when death looms large upon you, you see that, oh, why didn't I, spend my time planning all these little things? But sadly, by the time it is too late. So the decisions could be task specific, time specific, logical, consistent. You need to understand all these things. Consistency is very important. When the surgeon is literally forcing upon the patient to undergo a particular surgery, the patient might be frightened and he might agree to it. But later on, once he goes back home, he will say, no, I don't want. So consistency in decision making is also very important, and you need to document that. You just can't bully your patients to take a decision based on your preferences. It's not your body which is being talked about here. It is the patient's body and the patient's wishes. So the patient has the decision. is the decision maker. You need to understand that. So you need to change gears, you know. So in Chennai, when you're driving through the little by-lanes of Chennai, you need to drive in your second or third gear maximum. But when you're on the highway, you can drive in your fifth gear. So as you approach death, you need to change gears. You can't keep driving in the fifth gear on narrow lanes, right? So changing gears is important. Like if you have this malignant intestinal obstruction, what best you can do is that nursing at home in this lateral position, and you can see that subcutaneous port is fixed in his chest wall. With that, you can give comfort medications. You know, the patient is clearly dying. Give death a chance. Death is physiology. Understand that. This is a physician this thing order for life-sustaining treatment. Physician order for life-sustaining treatment. Here you can actually make choices whether CPR is warranted or not, whether what medical interventions the patient need, comfort measures only or full treatment, antibiotic use, whether you really want to continue with antibiotics, you want to continue with artificially administered nutrition or not. So many things. It needs to be documented and implemented also. Makes sense, actually. This is what we mean by changing gears. You need to step down on the intensity of treatment as the patient gradually enters the last few days or weeks of life. Symptom management is again a cornerstone of good palliative care. You need to control symptoms. I won't go into control of each and every individual symptom because it's a huge topic by itself. But whatever you're doing, ensure that you maintain the dignity of the patient, because that is the last thing which the patient has. He has lost everything, but please don't take away his dignity. So this is what rural India actually looks like. And this is when our volunteer, you can see our volunteer sitting with the patient. That lady is the patient. She's sitting with her husband. And in the background, you can see the cow also. So poverty is rampant in India, and naturally quality of life takes a backstage. But for them also, quality of life matters in terms that they would rather remain at home. They would rather die at home. They would rather die in a culturally appropriate manner at home rather than die in a five-star hospital in a culturally inappropriate manner. Your spirituality, your religiosity becomes very important, takes a very important role in your last days of life, right? So that needs to be respected as well. And when you go down into rural India, into resource poor settings like where I work, you need to make the best of whatever resources you have. It is not that you will always get a plaster or you will always get gauge pieces and betadine and everything. Do with whatever the best with whatever you have. You will find resources. Never say that there is nothing I can do. There is always something which you can do. Like this lymphedema here in this, and you can see the matted lymph nodes. You, as a surgeon, perhaps you would be thinking in terms of maybe some flaps or maybe some, lymphatic drainage procedures or something. No. What a palliative care physician would think in terms of massage, exercise, skin care, and compression, and that's it. Pain relief. Palliative chemotherapy is another very controversial area. And R.C. Stein actually said that if the medical profession is to demonstrate its ethical and clinical competence, it must accept the challenge of developing clear guidelines for chemotherapy usage in patients with metastatic cancer. So a very gray zone. And then there is palliative radiotherapy also, but that too can go horribly wrong at times with this. This is an extreme case. Again, you really don't want your patients to transit into such zones. And then there are so many barriers of palliative care when you actually go down into the community, into the rural community where most of India actually lives. So you have to approach them in a culturally appropriate and socially appropriate manner. You just can't barge into any village and barge into any house. Permissions are important. You know, the simple things like keeping your footwear outside, leaving your shoes or chappals outside the house, respectfully entering the house, you know, and approaching the folk of the house with respect. Those are little things which you actually can learn when you actually do these field trips. Poverty, unfortunately, is a major drawback, because unless your tummies are full, you can't even dream of quality of life. As they say, khali pet mein puja nahi hota hai. You can't even pray on an empty stomach. You need a full stomach before you can actually focus on your prayers. So the next time you come across any terminally ill patient and think what is the appropriate treatment, you need to think in terms of what is the prospect of life, what is the aim of treatment, what is the risk or benefit, and does it lead to a lingering death? Are you actually prolonging life, or are you actually prolonging the process of dying? So there is a difference in that. So a sensible approach is you need to focus on availability of resources. Consistency of availability is very important. Say if you're giving morphine tablets to a patient, you give morphine tablets for 2 weeks, and third week you say, oh, I don't have any more morphine, go ahead, get morphine yourself. And the poor patient is running around the whole of, Tamil Nadu looking for morphine and is not getting perhaps. So that should not be the way. So consistency in availability of resources is very important. Then accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. Acceptability also becomes very important. What is culturally acceptable to the patient? And this is where, as I say, the so-called quacks, they score above us, because they will go and start a IV infusion. They will start a drip, as they call saline, so-called. And the patient is very happy. The patient's relatives are very happy, because he has done an intervention which because that is culturally ingrained in their minds. They have seen a lot of Hindi films. So that is culturally ingrained in their minds that the doctor has come and started a drip for me. So I will definitely get better. It makes sense actually at times. Although scientifically it is nonsense, but you see, culturally and holistically for the patient, it makes sense. And then simple ways how to get things working, like this elderly lady with, you can see her pendulous breasts with breast cancer, and doing her dressings was a tedious job. It used to take the good part of an hour, putting the dressings in place. And this is how it used to look after the dressings were there. And it used to be so tight that this lady would just tear off the dressings within a couple of hours after the dressing was done, because she could hardly breathe with those huge dressings. And then we devised simple measures using sanitary napkins. So just 2 sanitary napkins would cover most of the area, and stick them with micropore, and they absorb excellently. Just change the dressings, and she was happy. We were happy. People take a lot of trouble and pain coming down to us. So we need to respect them for that. We need to respect their time which they give to come to us. This is another example. You can see this man had this huge growth, and the growth had spread into his hypopharynx also. So he had trouble in swallowing, and what he would chew would come out through the fistula in that ulcer. That ulcer had a fistula also. So I tried putting in a Ryle's tube through the nose, but it wouldn't go. There was, a little bleeding and all, so I got scared. And he was so poor that he couldn't afford a feeding gastrostomy. So in desperation, one day, I just took the Ryle's tube and put it through this fistula itself, through the malignant wound fistula. And by God's grace, it actually went in. And I left it at that. You see? So you need to think out of the box at times. And it actually works. What little you can do with whatever little resources you have, you need to make the best of it. And this is in the outskirts of Kolkata. I used to go there on a regular basis to see palliative patients, and there was no, I mean, I had no clinic out there. I used to travel 350 kilometers one way to go to reach Calcutta, and then I would go to see patients in the periphery. So I used to hire a car, and that car would act as my clinic. You know, I would take one patient inside, close the door, examine the patient, advise him, and then open the door. The patient would come out, second patient would get in. So nothing is impossible. You have all the resources at your disposal. You just have to be mindful of it, right? As they say, God is everywhere. You just need to look up. This is another example of how we give subcutaneous injections. This lady had, again, cancer of the hypopharynx. She couldn't swallow her pain medications also, and she had severe pain. And so we gave this is how we do the subcutaneous injections. We just take a butterfly scalp vein set and insert it and leave it at that. And we prepare the drug and give it to the patient's relatives and make them understand that they have to push just 1 ml at a fixed interval, say 6-hourly interval, 1 ml of the drug should be pushed in. And that is what they do. And the patient remains comfortable. And the family members are also so happy because it is a participative process. The family members are actually administering the injection through the tail of the scalp vein. So they feel that they are doing something for their loved one. So it makes a difference. See, after the injection, she's actually sleeping so peacefully. Communication and disclosure. This is another area where most of us try to run away from. You know, whenever it comes to declaring a death or something, what do? We send our juniors, and that junior would send even the junior. So we will send the senior resident will tell the junior resident, you go and declare the death. So again, I said, we are a death denying culture. We live in a death denying culture. So communication issues, what do we have? Premature reassurance, because we don't want to hear bad news. When the patient begins to sob or begins to cry, we immediately say, no, don't worry, everything will be okay. But even the patient understands that nothing is going to be okay. Selective attention, avoiding emotional issues, changing the topic frequently, and closed questions. Closed questions means those questions which are answered by a simple yes or no. So these are the protective things we assume while communicating with patients, which is absolutely wrong. Communication by itself is a huge topic, and I won't go into the details of this right now. Religious concerns. This becomes very important in the last days of life. You need to respect the religious or spiritual concerns of the patient, and please do not impose your own thoughts into at that time, because the patient is very vulnerable at that time. Do not impose. Respect and maintain the dignity. Dying is a very important individual event. It is an individual event. How you die and how I die would be different. What are your expectations from the dying process, and my expectations from the dying process would be different. Religiously also, there is a big difference in every religion, right? Grieving process is more traumatic when the physical distress is not relieved. That is, when a patient or when your loved one dies in pain, be it physical or psychological or social pain. If somebody dies in pain and suffering, then those memories are very painful memories. And this is a beautiful way of dying. Unfortunately, this beauty is no longer visualized in the modern world which we live in. this lady who is lying on the bed is clearly dying. In fact, just a few hours after this photograph was taken, she passed away. And that gentleman in that dhoti, that is her husband. And the lady who is giving her sips of the last few sips of water is her daughter-in-law. And the whole family is standing around. And you can see the rays of the sun are actually streaming in. It's a beautiful way to die, surrounded by your loved ones. But you see, unfortunately, most of us who are listening to this lecture today won't be so fortunate to die in this manner, because we have never planned for such type of death. But there is still time. We can actually walk that extra step and plan so that we die in a way which we would love to die, because death is inevitable, isn't it? I think I'll end my talk here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abhijit Ram. If you could just stop sharing your screen. Dr. Mallika, we'd like to hear from you. Can you please unmute yourself? Yes, Dr. Mallika.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Vidya, for giving me this opportunity and this wonderful opportunity, I must say, to be having to listen to Dr. Abhijit. It was really soul stirring, I must say, and because I've been in this field for 20 years, and I'm very happy, very emotional. It has become very glad to have heard the detailed aspects, and it's a very important thing. And I think he has so wonderfully brought out the humane aspect of medical care. That is what has been, I always say, palliative care has been the missing link in medical practice. And before others might want to ask, I just want to reiterate what he has said, just the salient points, so that it stays. And I think many points which are very important, especially the death insurance. It's something that I have not really heard, although we have learned about advanced directives and other things. I mean, you really drove in the message, I must say. And I don't think I've ever heard a better lecture than this on palliative care, Dr. Abhijit. It's really wonderful, I think, really very commendable. I think I just want to highlight certain points that he has made so clear. One is, of course, the early palliative care. It is, as he said, we are programmed, or we just don't open up. The Rig Veda says, open your mind, and then only you can let things come in. So it is still, the misconception is that palliative care is equal to terminal care, where terminal care is only part of palliative care, and he's brought that out so well right from the beginning, where it can be part of treatment. In fact, the World Health Organization, which has been observing this for so many years, brought out a mandate in 2014, May 2014, if I'm right, that palliative care should be integrated into the healthcare system. And it should be part, just as we say, the preventive, curative, rehabilitative. So palliative care also should be part and parcel of treatment of any disease. Like he said, exactly that slogan, any disease, any stage, any age. It's a very important message that we should. Palliative, the word means relieve, alleviate pain, alleviate suffering. So when does suffering start? We have to think. The very diagnosis, even if that cancer is curable, the the very word cancer or that has been mentioned brings so much of emotions, and not only that, lot of implications to the patient's and the family's mind. So this palliative care is a wide spectrum which can start right from the beginning, which he has clearly told. And the other thing I wanted to say was this ethics, medical ethics, which is very much significant and applicable in the, especially in the advanced stage, the terminal stage. This is also still not taught in the MBBS curriculum. I know that I think now it is called National Medical Commission or something like that, instead of the MCI. So they have brought in 2019 August, they included it into the MBBS curriculum, ethics, communication skills, management of chronic pain, but I don't know how much it's being implemented in the medical colleges. So that ethics is so important that he has told. And yes, still living patients, however, dying is, I think, every one of us is dying. That we have to agree that dying from the moment we are born, every day is gone. That is, so we are all like that. So, but taking care of patients, when especially the advanced stage, as he very rightly said, it is about taking care of the living while they are still alive, and not just dying. And that is very true also, that we have to create that environment in that world where we ourselves will be facing death, and what kind we do not know. Just think about this pandemic that's going on, entire world, and just shaking everybody, especially the implications of getting that disease, being alone, isolated. It is sometimes, I think, worse than the cancer or anything, that the isolation and fears and the uncertainties, all those things. And changing gears is very, very important. How we need to change our goals. First, the goals to cure, and then the goal to relieve symptoms, and the goal to minimize things, maximize the humaneness towards the end. That was very well brought out. And so I think this, and of course, the barriers to communication, because we simply haven't learned communication skills. I would never have known how to say the right things or how not to say the wrong things until I went for my training in palliative care. That's because it's just not included in the medical curriculum. I think I'll just wind up there and say that what Dr. Abhijit, I think you have driven very strong messages, given a very clear picture about what palliative care is about, and brought up the myths and misconceptions. And the day will have to come when it is there in the curriculum only, because for developing palliative care, you need three things mainly. One is the availability of morphine to treat severe pain, and two is the drug policy. We have to have a correct, but Tamil Nadu, Kerala state, many states have got clear drug policies now. And third is education. That is the main thing right now. So that should come, the day should come, so that every MBBS doctor will know what palliative care is, even whether he practices it or not. At least they might refer, or they'll know what to do. And we can all inculcate this practice in our day-to-day practice, inculcate palliative care into our day-to-day. And I really wish the private institutions also somehow create this palliative teams, send doctors, nurses for training. A lot of training courses are available. Indian Association of Palliative Care is doing it, and now we have all the online courses going on. So it will be very good if that comes up. And thank you very much for this opportunity, and I leave it to the floor.
Dr. Abhijit Dham and Dr. Mallika, if you don't mind, can you please put your email IDs on chat box, because there are some questions about what are good palliative care courses in India. And a question that I would like one of you to answer right away, it is, what is the scope of practice of palliative care? Dr. Sai Janani wants to know.
Dr. Abhijit is going to answer that.
Please unmute yourself, sir, Dr. Abhijit.
Yeah. Currently, as of today, the scope isn't very much, although the scope since the last, over the last few years has been increasing steadily but progressively. Most of the cancer institutes now have to have a palliative care unit. And so for manning the palliative care unit, you need palliative care physicians, right? And you can have standalone hospices also, which can work on a paid model. And if you tie it up with your oncology colleagues, they will definitely start referring their patients to your hospice. So one such good hospice has come up in Pune, and they are running it quite well. It's a private hospice, and I'm sure there are other private hospices in India as well. Uh, Definitely, the scope is there, and if you combine it with care of elderly, like what we do in our center, we call it preventive palliation, and although we do it for free, in the villages, we run this program in the villages for the elderly who can't actually walk to our center. So we do house to house visits for the elderly. So we call it preventive palliation. So if you combine your palliative care with care of elderly, so then sky is the limit, because care of elderly is a very broad concept where you can have long-term care facilities and so many things, short-term retreats, and so the scope of palliative care definitely is increasing as awareness is increasing day by day. So I think in the next couple of years or so, it will grow in importance even more. And definitely it's a budding and very satisfying, let me tell you, in a holistic way. You will be, at the end of the day, you can, sleep with a smile on your face. So that makes a difference.
We have Dr. Sujay, who is an onco surgeon. Dr. Sujay, would you like to ask or say something? Please unmute yourself.
The Vidya Dr. Subramaniam wants to comment.
Professor Subramaniam, sir.
No, it's a great speech today. Wonderful. I think to practice this art of medicine, you need two things. One is attention to details, and the other is patience. And patience in a doctor combined with human qualities. Every doctor has got human qualities. There is no dearth for it in anybody. So it is the patience, and also in an academic, associated world where there is explosion of knowledge, it is overtaken by kindness and humanity in the palliative care specialty, and your ability to attend to the details. And I know Dr. Mallika, who was in the training period itself, I saw her attending to every detail in the theater. She is wonderful. At that time itself, I predicted that she will one day rule the world with all her knowledge and skills, and her comment on the lecture reflected that. It contained a lot of, she is a wonderful, knowledgeable person, and attention to detail, everything. I know guys who have gone for palliative care, missing bed sores, and all that we have seen in happening, but it needs the commitment, and we have a personification of commitment and knowledge in Dr. Abhijit Dam in what he presented. And thank you very much, sir. And I thank Dr. Vidya and Radhakrishnan for allowing me to listen to a wonderful speech. Of course, I'm also getting older, so it's timely also. Thank you very much.
I would just like to add, can I just say a few things?
Yes, ma'am, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Subramaniam, for your very kind words. No, I just want to add to what Dr. Abhijit said about the scope of palliative care. The thing is, now we need to look at it as an approach. The palliative is an approach to any patient. So this is some basic principles. We can divide it as where we just learn the basic principles of palliative care, the symptom control and the communication skills, and adopt it in our day-to-day practice, whatever specialty we are doing. Like for example, and also, okay, and then that is one. Those who want to practice it purely, pure palliative specialists like Dr. Abhijit, myself, and others, that is also there. That is a choice that we make. So this, the ideal thing will be to integrate. See, if there is a hospital and somebody is specialized in palliative medicine, or there is a team, then that team is just called, just like we refer a patient to the neurologist or nephrologist or somebody like that, then the palliative physician can come in, because the same oncologists or doctors, everybody cannot do everything. So they can be referred to. So this is how I used to, for example, we run a hospital-based palliative care unit, although we do have home care and outpatient, inpatients and other things. So we just see the patient at the bedside and prescribe along with whatever problem that is going on. So like in Mangalore also, there is, so when you go there, the patient is referred for pain control or breaking the bad news or just the communication, and then the palliative team is called. So in that way, it will be good, and at the community level. So this, the government, if it helps, so what has happened is, we have been working with the government for many years, and the last, from 2017, National Health Mission gave us the opportunity to train all the 32, the doctors and nurses from all the 32 districts in Tamil Nadu. So they came here, 10 days training, and then they went back, and National Health Mission helped them to set up OP centers in, in the respective districts, and the OP is going on. So this comes at a community level. So I think basically that is again education. That is something, because everybody may not be practical to start hospitals. Everybody may not be able to do that. But ideally, if we can get it at the community level, that could be a best thing that we have.
Vidya, Dr. Bagdi has got some questions on the Facebook. One is, how much money will be spent by the family once they, for palliation, once they know the death is inevitable? Will they suddenly cut down on? Dr. Abhijit may answer this question.
Yeah, I have yet to see any family who would not like to spend some money to ensure that the patients spend their last days of life in comfort, right? I have yet to come across such a family, because they would concede to your requests as far as their financial implications permit them, right? But most of these patients who are from the lower class of lower financial strata of the society, their little savings have already been wiped out in the treatment part. So when they are referred to us quite late in the disease process, they are basically paupers. So at such periods of time, we take it upon ourselves to help them in a holistic way as far as possible, with medicines, with whatever little other support, even, trying to line up employments for them. And I'm sure there are the social service departments in various big hospitals like Tata Memorial Mumbai and other large regional cancer centers have the social workers who play a very active role in helping the family members of such terminally ill patients. So it's not just the responsibility of the medical of professionals, it's a social responsibility as well. The whole concept of palliative care is basically a philosophy of care combined with a social responsibility and awareness.
He has one more question, Dr. Bagdi. Can't palliative care be given by the primary doctor? Why do you need another physician to do that? I want both of you to comment.
See, palliative care is a specialty by itself. Although the basic, it's just like, say, for example, surgery. During our MBBS curriculum, we learn the basic principles of surgery, but that doesn't mean that everybody becomes a qualified surgeon, right? But then we are able to drain abscesses, small abscesses, and do very small suturings and that sort of thing. So palliative medicine is just like that. So if you learn the basics of palliative medicine, of palliative care, so you'll understand the basic principles like communications and treating pain in a holistic fashion, and the WHO step ladder pattern of treating pain, and so on and so forth, bereavement care and all. But if you go in for specialization, then you can attend to the finer aspects of palliative care, which definitely need much expertise, like spiritual care, or psycho-oncology. And so there are so many other subspecialties in the specialty of palliative medicine.
Yes, that's why the reference to interspecialties, interdisciplinary teams are also there. Rightly, as Dr. Abhijit said, if we learn, that's why I said, if it comes into the curriculum, then we know, just like we know we can give one paracetamol for headache or fever, etc. So we know the basic principles. The WHO ladder is still not there in the curriculum, which is there, which is for actually, or even non-cancer chronic pain, we can follow that. It's a guideline given by the WHO. 1986 it was given, and it is still not there. So these things, basic principles, yes, the physician himself, that will be the ideal situation. But definitely, if there are more intricate things to be handled, like a wound care, lymphedema, and other things, then they should feel free to refer to the specialist in palliative medicine.
Back to you, Vidya. You're muted.
No, you wrote a really long write-up as the sort of as a prelude to today's talk. So, you have any comments after having listened to the talk and the discussion?
It's a very moving and sentimental sort of a talk, I should say. I echo Dr. Mallika's comments on this particular lecture, and so much humanness to the whole thing. That this is the one other side of medicine which we clinicians don't really see, because as a surgeon, what we see a patient is whether it's operable or inoperable. Once it's inoperable, we switch off. We evade, we switch off, and we'll say no, you don't require surgery, we'll treat you with medicines, and there's a better doctor to treat you with medicines, and he'll just wash your hands off. And this is, I think, most clinicians do this, and they don't want to get in any sorts of, because to again answer the question why primary physicians don't deal with palliation is this: they don't want to have failure, as Dr. Abhijit commenting somewhere, that it's a defeat for a surgeon to deal with anything of this nature. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful lecture. And as I very strongly feel that every street will have a couple of patients rotting in their houses, looking for some support, help, painkillers, IV fluids. And, I think if you just look at the patient population is very huge, uncared for, when they lived a wonderful life, but they die a very poor death. I think this is, as a specialist emphasize again and again, this is an area which we all have to concentrate so much on from the very beginning of our medical education. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful lecture.
Dr. Raghavendran, your comments, please. Dr. Raghavendran?
Yeah, very good lecture, Dr. Abhijit. I think we're not disappointed. We really looking forward to listen to you. A real good talk, and it was a wonderful one actually. Now, just on behalf of the people who probably are so much impressed by your talk, and I just want to ask one question. What all challenges you had to overcome when you are trying to set up the palliative care? See, the thing is, there's not much of attention is given to preventive aspects of the care for any diseases. Most of the doctors are staying in the comfort zone of a curative care. Palliative care is even pushed to the periphery. Now, but as you mentioned, I think there's going to be a lot of scope, especially when you combine it along with old people's home, etc. So to get it off, to start it off, how do you think we should go off, and what are challenges which you're likely to encounter in starting a palliative care?
Yeah, challenges are so many, I at times try to cut off those difficult days, those difficult years rather. When I started off, people actually laughed at me, laughed behind my back, laughed right into my face. Uh, and then I had no money at that point of time. It was so very difficult to start off a initiative, because you definitely need some money, even like when you're going to the down to the villages, you need money for medications, you need money for bandages and so many other things. And it was a very difficult start. And at that point of time, I also felt that I should have a center so that people can identify with the center. Although palliative care is a concept, but then that concept, when you're working in a virgin community where people, even your colleagues don't understand the concept of palliative care, and they basically laughing at you, forget the general public at that point of time. So there was a lot of negative propaganda also. uh, those were very difficult days. And but then gradually over the period of time, I actually had to take a loan from my provident fund to actually buy a plot of land, and where I set up the hospice gradually, over starting from a small room and to what it is currently now. And then I had to empower myself with knowledge as well. I had to go abroad for training. Thankfully, I got scholarships. I even got the Commonwealth scholarship for my MSc and all. So God was kind, and I had to walk that extra mile for sure.
Absolutely. Now, my next question is Dr. Mallika. See, she is a very well-known anesthesiologist and with her own clinic. Her husband is a surgeon. And what made you to go towards palliative care, madam? Must have been.
Yes, thank you for asking. I didn't even know the meaning of the word palliative. You see, I was always, as an anesthetist also, I was always interested in relieving pain. I actually used to go the next day after the surgery and ask all the patients how the pain was, because we talk about post-scoline pain and other things. People say, are they your relative? They ask me. So I used to be very much interested also in chronic pain management. Then what happened, I was also hearing about Dr. M.R. Rajgopal, who was doing something like this in Calicut. And then rightly my 1999, 2000 almost, my father developed a severe stenotic, no, the age-related spinal stenosis pain, severe chronic backache. I did not know how to treat him. 20 years of anesthesia, and I was helpless. And he used to cry, man who stood tall, army person. He used to cry. So I took him to the doctor, some specialist in Chennai, and he just did not get relieved at all. I said, we are just going to pack up and go to Calicut. So we went to Calicut, my mother, my father, and I. And I just submitted myself to Dr. Rajgopal, who was just starting the palliative care and pain relief and all that. And I did not question at all. He did some procedures. But during that time, I used to be the attender, the other side of the thing. So I used to walk and get all these things for my parents. That time I used to see 80 to 90 patients in that outpatient clinic in palliative department, care department. So I really got motivated at that time. And I said, I've got to come back, because as you said, in our hospital itself, when patients came back after, the advanced stage, I did not know how to help them. So that is what motivated me. And that same year, I went for my 10-day, it was a 10-day residential course, which we had in Trivandrum, in Cochin. And Dr. Robert Wycross, he was the authority in palliative care from UK. That time there was nobody in India to teach also. So he and Miss Val Hunkin used to take communication classes, and he used to take the symptom management. And then of course I went on to do my other courses. That's how I got motivated.
Ravi, you wanted to ask something?
No, I was just going to say that, as a pediatrician, this part is one of the most heartbreaking parts, not just for surgeons. So when you have a child with multiple problems where you finally say that what you're doing is causing more pain and it's time to let the child go in as pain-free a way as possible is one of the most heartbreaking things, both for the entire team that's taking care of the child as well as the parents and their families. So it requires a very different mindset. And I think one of the themes in today's presentation was that as physicians, our job is to help patients, not cure them. I mean, cure might be the help for some of them, but for some others, it's not cure, it's helping them with their pain. So I think that's the most important lesson to take away from today's presentations. And it was absolutely lovely. And of course, I was also going to say that, since I'm no longer in clinical care, I was looking at this from my own perspective, like what can I do to make sure that I don't end up having all these kind of things done to me when I get to that point, where you lose dignity at that point. And so I see that you've already put the thing on the next session that you have, Vidya. So that would be very useful, the living will, or the advanced directives as it's called here in the United States. Anytime I tell my daughter something about it, she reminds me, she just says, put it in your advanced directives and I'll make sure I'll do it. So, so it is something that we all need to think about as well, not just something abstract for our patients.
One last question, Vidya, from my side to both the speakers. See, doesn't death affect you personally? Because don't you ever get upset? Don't you lose appetite over somebody's dying? Because as surgeons, we always do. Some patient passes, which is not a very common thing. We get upset and it shows on a face. Does it show on your faces?
Well, I actually was a very staunch atheist, till about 12 years back. And once I started getting involved more and more with palliative care, I became a believer. And then I started reading up the scriptures, and what help I got out of that was to understand death, dying, in terms of what Vedanta teaches us. And that went a long way in overcoming my own fears, or I won't call it fear, rather a tryst with the whole concept of death and dying. And nowadays, I actually see death as a doorway to something, to a better world, better future world. So the whole concept of afterlife is something which I find very fascinating, and in fact is the topic of my PhD, which I'm undertaking right now. So that is how I look at death, and so death no longer sort of scares me, because I see it as a gateway to something better. That's my own take at it.
Dr. Mallika, your comments?
Well, I think we have to reach that level of spirituality to take it, stoically. So we do get emotional. Even in the clinic, especially young patients and some of the patients, we do sometimes almost break down and we come out of the room and, come back. And seeing death definitely makes us emotional, but I'm also a very philosophical person, which where I that is my principle. Like I put everything surrender into God. Even now this pandemic thing, I'm just prepared. Last year I prepared everything myself for the generation, or no, that is the acceptance. So acceptance is it's very difficult to get, even when we see patients and their families also, getting them to accept the disease and the eventuality. It is, but there is some kind of the counseling has to be there. But for my own self, yes, I do get emotional, but I definitely come out of it very soon. And I very strongly believe that we have to be strong to help others if we want to continue with this care. And I don't impose this on anybody else. That is another thing, as Dr. Abhijit also explained. We cannot impose our beliefs, but there is a way of communicating, where we ask them questions and we get all the answers out and help them to cope with whatever helps them to cope. So this is what I help myself to cope with, is the philosophical attitude.
Ma'am, I have a very sensitive question, because whenever I see a patient, we see a lot of GI cancers. First, the patient's relatives will enter the room and says, please don't tell the patient that he's got cancer. And, we don't try to tell unless until the patient asks, what is your language? Do you talk to them in that language, or do their relatives tell you that let him die peacefully, not knowing he's got cancer?
This is a separate chapter. I know Dr. Abhijit will agree with me. It is called collusion. It is a separate thing that we teach under communication, where the doctor or the family colludes, not revealing the truth, which is not correct. So there is a way of dealing with that. The way we have to talk to the relatives, trying to convince them. And there are certain guidelines on which we go. Acknowledging is a very important aspect of communication. Acknowledging, when they say that, we always say why they don't want to tell. We know the answers. They will say, oh, they will get upset, he will commit suicide, etc. So there is a way of dealing with that with the family. So we don't straight away give answers. One thing we learn in communication is never give immediate answers. We answer with questions. So doesn't he have a right to know? Maybe he already knows. Has he said anything in any way that makes you suspect that he may know the diagnosis? So these are questions, these are things that we are taught in our communication skills. And that's how we get them to somewhat agree. At least he should know that it may not be curable, because you are saying this, but he may be thinking about certain things. So we need to ask, make them come out of get their whatever they have inside out by asking appropriately. So there is a way of dealing with that. Thank you for asking, Dr.
Dr. Abhijit, your views on this?
I absolutely agree with her, and no further comments on this, because it's a topic by itself. It's a huge topic. The whole concept of communication and collusion and conspiracy of silence, these are huge topics by itself. So what Madam Mallika said is absolutely to the mark.
Anybody else has any questions or comments? Please speak up, because we'll be winding up the session soon. Does anyone have any questions? If not, I'd like to thank Dr. Abhijit Dham and Dr. Mallika for an enthralling session. I also want to tell you that Dr. Abhijit has offered to do another talk on how to care for the caregiver. And that becomes extremely important with the aging population. Of course, there is a fraction of population where the elderly are living here alone, and the children are not there nearby, and they are cared for by paid help. But still in India, we still have a lot of people who we have to care for, our parents, grandparents, or people with chronic disease, or handicapped, or challenged children. So I will try and get Dr. Abhijit Dham back in July, hopefully, because we have all the other sessions already planned. And when we'll work on a date where he can talk about how to look after the caregivers. If no have any questions, we'll call it a day. Good night, everybody. Please take care and stay safe. And we'll be back next week with Dr. Vijay was talking about exercise, how to keep yourself healthy and fit. His talk on food and eating was a big hit. So we hope to do a good session next week on exercise. Thank you, everyone. Good night and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
very much.
Thank
And I'd like to be invited for Dr. Abhijit's talk.
My,
You will be invited for all the talks, madam. You can choose which one to attend. You will be on my list now.
Thank you all, and we are doing an excellent job doing all this. Thank you all. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.